Warren Pierce was no stranger to harsh winters, having lived in the remote Alaskan countryside all his life. He was well acquainted with sub-zero temperatures and howling winds. His log cabin, sturdy and worn, stood as a testament to years of surviving in one of the world's most unforgiving climates. Yet, despite his rugged experience, nothing could have prepared him for the sight that greeted him late one snowy evening. It had been an ordinary day, or as ordinary as it could be in the dead of winter. Warren had chopped enough firewood to last the night and checked on his small vegetable greenhouse, which was kept alive by a single heater. As dusk fell, he retreated indoors, content to spend the long, dark hours by his crackling fireplace with a mug of hot tea. Then came a strange scratching at his front door, accompanied by soft whines that cut through the night's silence. At first, Warren assumed it was a stray dog, perhaps one of the few feral canines that roam the outskirts of town. But as he peered out the frosted window, his heart began to pound. There, on his porch, stood two emaciated wolves. Their once proud coats were matted and dusted with snow, their breaths visible in the frigid air. Instead of snarling or acting aggressively, they trembled with cold and exhaustion. One of them even mustered a weak howl, as if calling for help. Warren's instincts battled with his caution. Wolves were, after all, wild predators. But these animals didn't appear menacing. They seemed desperate. Against his better judgment, Warren grabbed a flashlight and cautiously cracked open his door. The closer wolf took a shaky step forward, its glowing eyes filled not with hostility, but with a pleading intensity. In that moment, any fear he felt was overshadowed by a surge of compassion. What had driven these creatures to seek shelter from a human, and if he let them in, would his act of kindness invite danger into his home? Thus began an extraordinary encounter between a solitary man and two wild wolves. An encounter that would test Warren's resolve, challenge his preconceived notions of nature, and lead him to an outcome no one could have predicted. Warren stood at the threshold of his cabin, heart pounding as he took in the sight of the two wolves. Snow swirled around them, collecting in small drifts by his front door. The temperature had plummeted well below zero, and he could see the animals shivering under their fur. Their wide, luminous eyes seemed to plead for warmth and safety. It was a sight both mesmerizing and unsettling, wild predators begging for sanctuary. Still clutching the doorknob, Warren hesitated. Common sense dictated that inviting wolves into his home was a terrible idea. They were wild, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous. Yet, the longer he stared into their haunted expressions, the more convinced he became that they posed no immediate threat. Their trembling bodies and weary demeanor spoke of desperation, not aggression. With a measured inhale, he made a decision. Wincing against the wind, he opened the door wider and gestured for them to come inside. The wolves exchanged a glance, if it could be called that, before cautiously padding forward, their paws leaving faint imprints in the blowing snow. The moment their fur made contact with the cabin's warmth, a shudder seemed to pass through them, as though they were finally releasing the tension they'd carried for miles in the cold. Gracefully, the pair stepped across the threshold and stopped just inside the living area. Warren, moving slowly to avoid startling them, closed the door, sealing out the howling wind. He offered a silent prayer that his instincts weren't wrong. The wolves stood still for a moment, their breaths loud in the sudden quiet of the cabin. Then they began exploring with careful curiosity, noses to the ground, sniffing at furniture, in the small pile of firewood near the hearth. Warren stood close by, silently observing. One wolf, a bit smaller with a patch of gray fur across its back, limped slightly, favoring its hind leg. Its ribcage was visible beneath its coat, indicating a long period of hunger. The other wolf, slightly bigger, had a scar running along its muzzle. Despite their emaciated state, they held a quiet dignity, moving without haste or panic. Warren couldn't help but feel a twinge of awe at their raw beauty. He approached the fireplace, tossing in another log to bolster the heat. The crackling flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the cabin filled with a warm glow. The wolves turned their attention to the fire, one of them letting out a soft whine as it drew closer. Perhaps it was the first time they'd ever been near such a source of warmth. As the room grew cozier, Warren realized he needed to address the obvious next step, food. He rummaged through his modest pantry, pulling out some meat he'd planned to cook for himself. He wondered if feeding wolves raw cuts was wise, but given their condition, he didn't see much choice. Returning to the living area, he sat down a plate of meat on the floor, then stepped back. The smaller wolf approached first, sniffing cautiously before taking a tentative bite. The larger wolf joined, and together they devoured the meal within seconds, their eyes reflecting gratitude and relief. Warren felt a pang of sympathy. How long had it been since they'd eaten? The wild was brutal, and the bitter cold made hunting nearly impossible for weak or injured animals. Once fed, the wolves seemed to relax further, their tense postures softening. Warren, still keeping a respectful distance, settled into a chair near the fireplace. He was keenly aware of the risk he was taking, but something about the wolves' demeanor reassured him. They were exhausted, possibly near death's door, and had reached a point where pride and caution gave way to survival instinct. The fact they allowed him in such close proximity spoke volumes about their desperation and their trust. The hours passed in an odd sort of companionship. Warren tended the fire, flipping through an old novel he'd read countless times, while the wolves dozed fitfully, occasionally lifting their heads at a gust of wind outside or the faint crackle of the hearth. At one point, the larger wolf whimpered softly in its sleep, paws twitching as though running in a dream. Warren felt an unexpected urge to soothe it, but he refrained, respecting the boundary between them. Night wore on, and eventually Warren prepared a makeshift bedding area near the warmest corner of the cabin. He coaxed the wolves there, offering blankets and extra logs on the fire. They accepted, though somewhat wearily, curling up with noses tucked under tails. Watching them, Warren realized he should probably get some rest himself. The day had been anything but ordinary, and fatigue weighed on him. Before turning in, he double-checked the locks on his doors and windows, an old habit in bear country. Now, it seemed doubly important, given that he had 2 wolves inside. As he dimmed the lights, he found himself silently praying for a peaceful night, free of conflict. He couldn't help but recall stories of wolf attacks, yet his gut told him these creatures were not here to harm him. The first stirrings of dawn arrived sooner than expected. Warren awoke to the gentle glow of sunrise, filtering through the frosted windows. He checked the living area, half expecting chaos or some sign of aggression, but instead, he found a quiet scene. The wolves were awake, yet calm, watching him with expressions that he could only describe as weary gratitude. He stoked the fire, noticing that the smaller wolf's limp seemed worse this morning. Perhaps it had strained itself further during the night. Concerned, Warren decided to see if it would allow him closer. Moving slowly, he knelt and extended his hand. The wolf eyed him, but remained still, as though sensing he meant no harm. Gently, Warren placed his hand on the wolf's hind leg. It flinched, emitting a soft growl of pain, but didn't snap. He detected swelling, maybe an old injury or frostbite. Medical treatment would be risky, but he couldn't stand idly by. "I'll do what I can," he murmured, as if the wolf could understand. Standing, he gathered a basic first aid kit from his cupboard, mentally thanking his years in the Boy Scouts. He had no veterinary experience, but he could at least clean and bandage the wound. The real challenge would be whether the wolf trusted him enough to permit it. Watching from the corner, the larger wolf tensed, its amber eyes fixed on Warren's every move. Sensing the delicate balance of trust, Warren proceeded with the utmost caution. He knelt beside the smaller wolf, who lay trembling on the blankets, and murmured soothing words. If the wolf allowed this, he might just be able to help. If not, he'd have to back off. One wrong move could trigger the primal instinct still lurking beneath their fragile truce. The smaller wolf stared at Warren with a mix of apprehension and pain, its body quivering as if it were unsure whether to trust this human crouched before it. Warren gently patted the blankets, hoping to coax the wolf into lying still. To his relief, it let out a low whine and rested its head on its paws. The larger wolf remained close by, watching the scene intently, ready to intervene at the slightest hint of threat. Warren opened his rudimentary first aid kit, a mismatched collection of bandages, antiseptics, and gauze. He hadn't used it much in the past, aside from treating the occasional scratch or blister from chopping wood. This was a different scenario entirely. He moved slowly, speaking in soft tones, aware that the smaller wolf could lash out if spooked. "Easy, fellas," he murmured, placing a folded towel beneath the wolf's injured hind leg. As he dabbed antiseptic on a cotton swab, the wolf let out a faint growl, but didn't pull away. The wound wasn't deep, but it was inflamed, possibly from an earlier injury that had been aggravated by the cold and constant movement. Warren's heart clenched at the thought of how much suffering this creature had likely endured in the wild winter landscape. The larger wolf paced a few feet away, letting out a low rumble of concern. Warren glanced at it, offering a quick nod in acknowledgement. "I'm doing my best," he said, as though the wolf could truly understand. He knew it was a risk to speak aloud and draw attention to himself, but he hoped his calm tone would keep the tension at bay. After cleaning the wound and applying a light bandage, Warren carefully examined the wolf's paw pads, noticing cracks and signs of frostbite. He used a mild ointment to soothe the raw skin before gently wrapping the leg with gauze. Throughout the process, the wolf flinched and whimpered, but remained surprisingly cooperative. Once he finished, Warren exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Done," he whispered, slowly removing his hands. The wolf exhaled through its nose, the sound almost like a sigh of relief. Warren offered a small smile, a surge of empathy welling up inside him. With the immediate medical needs addressed, Warren turned his attention to the basic matter of survival. He checked his pantry to see what remained of the food he'd given the wolves earlier. He still had enough supplies to feed them again, but his stock was limited. The realization weighed on him. If these wolves intended to stay longer than a day or two, he'd need a plan to secure more resources, something that wasn't easy during the harsh Alaskan winter. He decided to head out briefly to gather more firewood and check on potential hunting opportunities nearby. Grabbing his coat and gloves, Warren paused at the door, glancing back at the wolves. They watched him, but made no move to follow. "I'll be back soon," he said softly, as if reassuring both them and himself. Stepping outside, Warren was greeted by a stark landscape of white. The sky remained overcast, and the wind cut through his layers of clothing. He trudged through knee-high snow to the woodpile near the edge of his property, filling a sled with logs. Every so often, he scanned the horizon, half expecting to see more wolves or any sign of threatening wildlife. His mind raced with questions. Had these two been part of a larger pack? Were they outcasts? And what would happen if their pack came looking? Once the sled was loaded, Warren took a moment to survey the silent wilderness. The land was beautiful, but it also felt eerily unforgiving. He caught himself imagining the smaller wolf, limping through these drifts, hungry and wounded, pushed to the brink of desperation. The thought reaffirmed his decision to help. No creature should have to endure such suffering alone. Upon returning to the cabin, Warren found the wolves lying near the fireplace. The smaller one looked to be in better spirits, occasionally licking at its bandaged leg. The larger wolf, ever vigilant, lifted its head to watch him cross the threshold. Warren unloaded the wood by the fireplace and stoked the flames, sighing in relief as the heat spread across his numb fingers. He unwrapped a portion of his remaining meat supply, placing it on a plate and setting it on the floor. The wolves approached cautiously, grateful for the meal, but aware of Warren's presence. As they ate, he considered how surreal the situation was. 2 wild wolves devouring his provisions within the comfort of his living room. Yet, he felt no fear, only a growing bond forged through mutual survival. Hours later, the cabin had fallen into a peaceful rhythm. Warren dozed in his armchair by the fire, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. The wolves rested on the blankets he'd arranged for them, rising only to lap water from a bowl he'd placed nearby. It occurred to him that he should contact someone, perhaps a local ranger or wildlife specialist. But a part of him worried that doing so might lead to the wolves being taken away, or, worse, put down if deemed a threat. Conflicted, he resolved to wait another day, to see if they'd regain their strength and perhaps wander back into the wild on their own. He felt a twinge of guilt at the thought of wanting to keep them around longer. Their presence, though unusual, gave him a sense of purpose. Night fell again, and the wind howled outside. Inside the cabin, the glow of the hearth remained a steadfast beacon against the darkness. Warren, restless from the day's events, found himself pacing. The wolves watched him, their gaze quiet and understanding. It was as if they recognized his turmoil. Eventually, he sank into the chair, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. What would the morning bring? Would the wolves depart, returning to the life nature intended for them? Or would they linger, forging an even deeper connection to this human who had opened his heart and home? Warren couldn't be sure. All he knew was that the next few days would test his compassion, his resourcefulness, and possibly his limits. Dawn broke with a fragile light, casting a pale glow across the snow-covered landscape. Inside Warren's cabin, the warmth of the hearth enveloped him and his 2 unexpected guests. As he stirred from sleep, Warren noticed something peculiar. The larger wolf was no longer lying by the fire. A slight sense of alarm washed over him. Had it slipped out into the night? Could it have ventured back into the freezing wilderness? His concern was quickly answered by a low growl emanating from the far corner of the living room. There, standing protectively over the smaller, injured wolf, was the larger one, its ears flattened, hackles raised. It wasn't looking at Warren, however, but rather at the door.
Warren's heart lurched. What had startled the wolf? Rising cautiously, he moved toward the window. Outside, in the morning's half-light, he caught sight of movement. Something was skulking just beyond the edge of his property, near the tree line. His breath fogged the coal glass as he peered out more intently. At first he thought it might be another animal, a moose or a bear, but then a human silhouette emerged from behind a thick pine. Adrenaline coursed through Warren. He didn't often have visitors, especially not during the harshest part of winter. Grabbing his coat and a flashlight, he pressed an ear to the door, listening for any sound. The larger wolf continued to growl, as though reinforcing the warning that someone was out there. The smaller wolf struggled to rise, whimpering softly. "It's all right," Warren whispered, hoping to soothe them both, and himself. He opened the door just a crack, a blast of cold air rushing in. Outside, the figure had vanished from immediate view, but footprints in the snow led around the side of the cabin. Warren stepped out, nerves on edge. The wind nipped at his face and he tucked his gloved hands under his arms. Scanning the tree line, he caught a glimpse of motion again, near the woodpile this time. Curiosity clashed with caution. Whoever was skulking around might be in trouble, or they might pose a threat. Summoning courage, Warren raised his voice. "Hello. If you need help, say something." The only response was the howling wind. He took a few tentative steps forward, leaving footprints that overlapped those of the mysterious intruder. His heart thumped loudly in his ears. Had news spread about the wolves? Could someone be searching for them, or planning harm? When no answer came, he decided to circle around the cabin to check for damage or signs of forced entry. The snow crunched underfoot, every sound amplified in the crisp air. The path led him past the woodpile, where he noticed fresh gouges in the bark of a nearby tree. As he leaned in to inspect, a sudden voice made him whirl around. "Are they inside?" a woman's voice demanded, low and urgent. She was bundled in a heavy parka, her face partially concealed by a hood and scarf. Only her eyes were visible, intense, worried eyes that flickered toward the cabin's door. Warren raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "Who are you?" he asked, attempting to keep his tone calm despite the jolt of surprise. Her gaze narrowed. "I'm hunting those wolves," she said, as though it were obvious. "They belong to a nearby pack. They went missing, and I've been tracking them for days." The statement startled Warren. "Hunting them," he echoed, his pulse quickening. Fear for the wolves gripped him. Was this woman intent on harming them? Or could she be a ranger or researcher? She exhaled, her breath forming a small cloud. "Not like that," she clarified, as if reading his expression. "I'm trying to help them. I'm with a wildlife rehabilitation group. We've been monitoring this pack for a while, especially these two." Her voice softened with concern. "The smaller one's been injured and separated from the group. They won't survive out here alone."